King John. Let's talk about our first monarch, probably England's most infamous king. And yes, the villain from the Robin Hood stories wasn't entirely fiction. Born the youngest son of Henry II, John wasn't expected to rule. But after his brother Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, he grabbed the throne. And oh boy, it went downhill fast. First, he lost Normandy to France in 1204, a humiliation that cost England most of its French lands and drained the treasury as he tried and failed to win them back. To fund wars, John hammered his barons with brutal taxes and fines. Some chroniclers even call him the worst king alive, a ruler who starved prisoners to death, sold justice to the highest bidder, and took hostages from noble families just to keep them in line. His battles weren't only with nobles, he also clashed with the Pope. At one point, England was placed under a papal interdict, meaning no church services or Christian burials nationwide for nearly 5 years. Imagine the fury that caused. By 1215, his nobles had had enough. They forced him to seal the Magna Carta, a document meant to limit royal power. John tried to break it immediately, sparking war, and he died the next year from illness while on campaign. His reign is remembered as the textbook example of tyranny, but ironically, his failures gave birth to one of the most important legal landmarks in history.
Edward II. Now let me introduce you to one of England's weakest and most tragic rulers. Crowned in 1307 after his father, Edward I, a tough warrior king, Edward II was the total opposite. Where his father won battles, Edward lost them. His reign was defined by his obsessive trust in favorites, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despencer. He poured titles, lands, and power on them, while ignoring both his barons and his French queen, Isabella. That favoritism poisoned politics. When war with Scotland broke out, Edward faced Robert the Bruce, and the result was disaster. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, England suffered one of its worst defeats, shattering his credibility as a king and soldier. Meanwhile, Gaveston was executed by angry nobles, but Edward repeated the same mistakes with Despencer. Barons rebelled, lands were seized, and England fell into civil conflict. The final blow came from his own wife. In 1326, Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, led an invasion, forcing Edward to abdicate in favor of his teenage son, Edward III. A year later, Edward II died in captivity under murky, perhaps brutal circumstances. Edward's reign became a cautionary tale. Ignore your nobles, lose your wars, and even your queen may decide you're unfit to wear the crown.
Richard II came to the throne in 1377, just 10 years old. Too young to rule, obviously, his regents managed things until he came of age. Unlike warrior kings before him, Richard loved style, ceremony, and art. He painted himself almost like a saint on earth. But his sense of grandeur outweighed his ability to lead. In 1381 came the Peasants' Revolt. Thousands of rebels marched on London, furious over brutal taxes. Richard, still a teenager, showed courage by facing them in person, but he made promises he had no intention of keeping. When the rebellion collapsed, he cracked down, leaving ordinary people bitter and mistrustful. Over time, Richard's behavior grew more tyrannical. He feuded with powerful nobles, exiled or executed critics, and ruled with increasing paranoia. The image of the royal majesty he loved so much became disconnected from the reality that his kingdom was slipping away. In 1399, his cousin, Henry Bullbrink, returned from exile with an army. Richard was abandoned, forced to surrender the crown, and Henry became Henry IV. Richard II died in captivity, likely starved to death. His reign is remembered as a warning. Ceremony cannot replace competence, and tyranny makes even crowned kings disposable.
Henry VIII. One of few names in English history loomed as large as Henry VIII. When he inherited the crown in 1509, England expected another charming Renaissance ruler. Instead, they got one of the most controversial monarchs of all time. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir drove nearly everything he did. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry broke away from the Catholic Church altogether in the 1530s. Out of personal desire, he launched the English Reformation, making himself head of the Church of England. This wasn't just a break with Rome. Henry seized monasteries, wealth, and land, reshaping the nation's entire religious landscape. His reign was also marked by executions. Trusted advisors like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell met the axe. So did 2 of his 6 wives. We all know the grim rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Yet, Henry wasn't all destruction. He strengthened the navy, invested in grand palaces, and projected England as a rising European power. Still, his later years were plagued by obesity, paranoia, and cruelty. Henry VIII's legacy is a contradiction, remembered as both a cultural Renaissance monarch and a tyrant who changed English religion and law forever.
Mary I, or Bloody Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, came to the throne in 1553 as England's first crowned queen regnant. Her reign was short, only 5 years, but earned her one of history's darkest nicknames, Bloody Mary. A devout Catholic, Mary was determined to overturn her father's break with Rome. She restored papal authority and set about re-establishing Catholic worship across the kingdom. But it was her persecution of Protestants that defined her. Nearly 300 men and women were burned at the stake, often in crowded marketplaces, meant to terrorize others into submission. Instead, the burnings hardened Protestant resistance and made Mary infamous. She also married Philip of Spain, a deeply unpopular match. Many English feared their country would become a satellite of Catholic Spain, and her failure to produce an heir only deepened dissatisfaction. When she died in 1558, power passed to her half-sister Elizabeth. Mary's legacy is haunted by fire and fear. Though she restored Catholicism briefly, her harsh measures ensured that when England turned Protestant under Elizabeth, it would never look back. Her reign became the ultimate warning of how religious zeal can burn a reputation forever. Elizabeth I, she followed her half-sister Mary to the throne in 1558 and is often celebrated as one of England's greatest monarchs, the Virgin Queen, presiding over the Elizabethan Golden Age. But beneath that glowing image lies a far more controversial story. Elizabeth projected herself as a tolerant, pragmatic ruler. She carefully balanced Catholics, Protestants, and even Puritans within the new Church of England. Yet, when religious dissent crossed her patience, she struck hard. Catholics plotting against her faced imprisonment or death, and Puritans pushing reforms were silenced. The greatest challenge came from Mary, Queen of Scots, her own cousin. After years of house arrest, Elizabeth finally signed Mary's death warrant in 1587, a decision that horrified monarchs across Europe. She also brutally suppressed Irish rebellions, sending armies that committed atrocities, left fields scorched, and fueled deep resentment that echoed for centuries. And still, her reign produced Shakespeare, Drake, Raleigh, and famous victories like the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. Elizabeth I remains a paradox, hailed as a symbol of English pride and strength, yet remembered by many as a ruthless survivor who cloaked power politics in pageantry. Charles I inherited the throne in 1625. And quickly showed he was a king obsessed with the divine right to rule. He believed his authority came directly from God, and he wasn't about to share it with Parliament. When Parliament pushed back against his spending and foreign policies, Charles simply dissolved it. Not once, but 3 times. Then, he ruled alone for 11 years, raising money through forced loans and taxes without approval. Many saw it as tyranny wrapped in royal robes. Religious disputes made things worse. Charles married a Catholic queen, supported controversial reforms in the Church of England, and infuriated his Protestant subjects.
Scotland outright rebelled when he tried to impose his prayer book there. By 1642, tensions erupted into the English Civil War, royalists backing the king versus parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell. Charles lost, surrendered, then disastrously reignited the conflict before being captured again. In 1649, he was put on trial for treason against his own people, a radical concept at the time, and was executed outside Whitehall. Charles I became the only English king to lose both his throne and his head, turning his belief in absolute monarchy into the ultimate downfall.
James II came to the throne in 1685, but his short reign would trigger one of England's most dramatic turning points. His biggest crime in the eyes of his people was simple. He was openly Catholic in a fiercely Protestant nation. To make matters worse, James promoted Catholics into the army, government, and universities, decisions that fueled suspicion he was building a Catholic state. At first, many tolerated him, assuming his Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, would eventually succeed him. But in 1688, his second wife gave birth to a Catholic son, raising the prospect of a lasting Catholic dynasty. That was the breaking point. Nobles across the political spectrum secretly invited Mary and her husband, the Dutch Prince William of Orange, to invade. When William landed with his army, James's supporters melted away. Even his own daughter sided against him. The event became known as the Glorious Revolution, glorious because it was bloodless in England. James fled into exile in France, and Parliament offered the crown jointly to William and Mary. James II's fall proved that in England, kings ruled with Parliament's consent, not above it, and the monarchy would never again claim unchecked power. George III came to the throne in 1760, young and confident, declaring he gloried in the name of Britain. But his long reign, nearly 60 years, became one of controversy, loss, and decline. The biggest stain on his record was losing the American colonies. After years of costly wars, Britain's attempts to raise taxes in America sparked the Revolution. By 1783, Britain had surrendered territories once seen as the jewel of its empire. Across the Atlantic, George was branded a tyrant. In Britain, the defeat damaged his image of competence. At home, political instability plagued his reign. Governments rose and fell, unable to maintain majority support. Meanwhile, George himself battled devastating mental illness. Known to the public as the Mad King, modern historians suspect bipolar disorder or porphyria. In his later years, episodes of breakdown left him blind, delusional, and unable to rule. By 1811, Parliament appointed his son as Prince Regent. Though mocked in his time, George III is now seen with more sympathy. A hardworking monarch who loved farming and family life, but whose reign was overshadowed by global upheaval and personal tragedy.
George IV. If George III was tragic, his son George IV was scandalous. Known as the Playboy Prince, he was infamous for his extravagance, indulgence, and endless debts. Even before becoming king in 1820, George's reputation was in tatters. As Prince Regent, he threw lavish parties, collected obscene amounts of art and fashion, and lived well beyond his means. Parliament had to bail him out multiple times, which only deepened his unpopularity with ordinary taxpayers. His private life was even worse. George secretly married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, which was illegal under royal law. Later, he officially married Queen Caroline of Brunswick, and he loathed her. Their marriage collapsed immediately, and his attempts to divorce her publicly in 1820 turned into a scandalous national spectacle. Crowds actually cheered Caroline in the streets and mocked the king as a hypocrite. Physically unhealthy from drinking and gluttony, George became bloated and reclusive. Though he supported projects like the magnificent Royal Pavilion at Brighton, his decade on the throne left little positive legacy. George IV is remembered as a monarch who embodied excess, adored luxury, despised duty, and earned the hatred of his own people.
Edward VIII. His reign was one of the shortest in British history, but his decision in 1936 caused one of the greatest royal crises ever.
Handsome, modern, and hugely popular as Prince of Wales, Edward became king in January 1936. But almost immediately, he made it clear he wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. To Edward, it was love. To the government and the Church of England, it was unacceptable. A king was not allowed to marry a divorced woman with 2 living ex-husbands. Edward now faced a choice: monarchy or marriage. By December, he shocked the world by choosing Simpson, abdicating the throne after just 11 months with the famous words, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." His younger brother became George VI, father of Elizabeth II. But Edward's controversies didn't end there. During the late 1930s, he and Wallis were photographed meeting Hitler, sparking suspicion of Nazi sympathies. Edward's story remains infamous, the king who gave up a crown for love, and in the process shook the monarchy to its core.
Richard III. Few monarchs divide opinion like Richard III. He ruled for just 2 turbulent years, yet his reputation has lasted over 5 centuries. Richard came to power in 1483 after the death of his brother, Edward IV. As uncle to the young heirs, Edward V and his brother Richard, he was meant to act as protector. Instead, he declared them illegitimate and took the crown himself. The 2 boys, the famous princes in the Tower, vanished soon after, likely murdered. Many believed Richard ordered their deaths, though definitive proof has never been found. His reign was marked by ruthless pragmatism. He rewarded loyal supporters but alienated large parts of the nobility. Still, he wasn't without talent. Richard reformed laws, improved access to justice, and promoted English trade. But his fate was sealed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where Henry Tudor defeated and killed him in combat, ending the Plantagenet dynasty. Later, Shakespeare immortalized Richard as a crooked-backed villain, cementing him as England's greatest royal monster. Modern historians, however, argue he may have been smeared by Tudor propaganda. Whether tyrant or tragic figure, Richard III's name remains synonymous with controversy, proof that history can crown you twice, once in life and forever in reputation.
Henry VI became the King of England in 1422, just 9 months old. He inherited not only the crown, but also the vast English possessions in France, won by his legendary father, Henry V. Sadly, he lacked his father's fire. Deeply pious and gentle, Henry disliked war and politics. But worse, he suffered from periods of catatonic mental illness that left him unresponsive for months. During these collapses, the kingdom descended into factional struggles. While England needed strong leadership in France, Henry's weakness led to a rapid collapse. By the 1450s, almost all English territories were lost, except Calais. At home, noble rivalries between the Lancaster and York families erupted into the Wars of the Roses. Deposed in 1461 by Edward of York, Henry regained the crown briefly in 1470, only to lose it again within months. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, he died in 1471, most likely murdered on Edward IV's orders. Henry VI is remembered as the saintly man in the wrong role, kind in spirit, but utterly incapable of ruling. His fragile reign turned England into a battlefield for decades.
William II. His nickname was Rufus for his ruddy complexion or fiery temper, inherited the throne in 1087 from his father, William the Conqueror. His reign, though brief, was marked by controversy and ended in mystery. William ruled with a reputation for greed and blasphemy. Chroniclers accused him of mocking the church, taxing both nobles and peasants heavily, and living a coarse, extravagant life. He fought campaigns in Normandy, put down rebellions, and generally ruled as a hard, ruthless king. But what makes William II so infamous is his death. In 1100, he was struck by an arrow while hunting in the New Forest. Officially, it was an accident, but was it?
Some claimed the arrow was deliberately fired by a nobleman, Walter Tyrrell, in a clot. Others suggested his younger brother Henry, who immediately seized the crown as Henry I, had arranged it. In any case, William's body was left on the forest floor for hours, abandoned by courtiers, while his brother rushed to grab the throne. William II remains one of the great royal mysteries, a king despised in life and remembered in death as possibly assassinated under the guise of an accident.
Henry II, ruling from 1154, was one of the most capable kings of the Middle Ages. He restored order after the Civil War, expanded royal justice, and laid the groundwork for the English legal system that still echoes today. But his reign is forever haunted by the murder of one man. The king's fiery personality led him into conflict with Thomas Becket, his former friend, whom he had appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry expected Becket to support royal power over the church, but instead, Becket became its staunchest defender. Their feud raged for years. In 1170, during one of Henry's infamous rages, he allegedly shouted, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights took that as an order. They stormed Canterbury Cathedral and assassinated Becket at the altar. The crime sent shockwaves across Christendom. Henry was forced to do public penance, famously walking barefoot to Becket's tomb and submitting to flogging by monks. Though he continued to rule effectively, his reputation never recovered. Henry II is remembered as both a brilliant lawgiver and the man whose temper led to one of the most scandalous murders in English history.